idea that I am, in fact, trying to score points. I'd like to point out that as the member of the opposition, my goal in my role, my job, is actually to hold the government to account and to ensure that there are no unfortunate or inappropriate relationships. That's my job. So.
In advance. Thank you very much. As I don't have much time left, here's my next question. Mr. Minister, we were talking about the email exchange between a public servant and at Heritage Canada and Kevin Chan from Facebook. Do you consider that serious? Elizabeth Thompson wrote on CBC this morning that Facebook is calling on the government to regulate Facebook. I take that with a pinch of salt myself. You don't seem to find this situation particularly serious. What I answered to your colleague earlier was that I consulted the Deputy Minister to determine whether or not a code of ethics or the like had been violated. That was not the case. Do we lose? Are we losing federal public servants from Heritage Canada to go and work in the private sector in these organizations? That is not the situation either. Between you and me and everyone else who is listening, I think that we should share the heat that's coming from all of these organizations in their current situation. The heat is on the platforms currently. So I think that can explain why they're calling on the government to interact.
I have a few questions. First of all, I take deep offense to the idea that I am, in fact, trying to score points. I'd like to point out that as the member of the opposition, my goal in my role, my job, is actually to hold the government to account and to ensure that there are no unfortunate or inappropriate relationships. That's my job. So I'm not scoring political points, but considering the work that this committee will be doing and considering the close relationship with Facebook, it is vital that I actually do take that on. So I want to just be very, very clear. Has your political, and this is a question for the minister, I would prefer if you answered. Has your political staff ever circulated a job offer from Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, or Google since you took office as the Minister of Heritage?
Not to my knowledge.
Thank you. The other issue that I have, I take a bit of offense with as well, is when we asked about your relationship, but when my colleague from the Conservatives asked about your relationship with Facebook or the department's relationship with Facebook and the consultation being done with Facebook, you compared the consultation with Facebook to meeting with the NCCM. And I find that very problematic. You know, when we see the vast amount of hatred towards the Muslim community on Facebook, to compare those two, I think is massively problematic. And I guess one of my questions is, you know, for example, the Proud Boys that were recently labeled by this parliament as a terrorist entity. We know that Facebook has allowed the Proud Boys to organize and share their content on their platform, as well as to promote their posts to their users. So knowing this, why do you think that it is acceptable for you or your officials to have meetings with Facebook about legislation such as C10 and presumably the legislation that will be seen on hate speech?
I'm not sure I understand I'm not sure I understand the question. So, I mean, if we're doing legislation, we should gather as wide an array of opinions and points of views as possible to ensure that we have all the information we need as legislator when we do move ahead with legislation. As an environmentalist, I would talk to people in the oil and gas sector all the time to understand what they were thinking. and I think government should we only be talking to these people? That would be hugely problematic. That's not at all what we're doing. I mean, we've consulted, and we'd be happy to share with you, but about 50, 60 organizations on specifically on the issue of on online hate. That's not broadcasting or what we're doing on media, but specifically on online hate. So yes, we spoke to Google and Facebook, but we spoke to a bunch of other organizations as well.
Thank you, Minister. I appreciate that. Folks, I'd like to thank the Minister and his staff for being with us today. I'm going to have to break very quickly to suspend to get ready for our next guest. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, sir, for your opening remarks. We're now going to go to the first round of questioning. I'm going to go to Mr. Waugh of the Conservative Party for 6 minutes.
Sorry, I apologize. I did the classic, I was on mute mistake. My apologies.
Oh,
I may continue.
I thought you ran out of steam. My apologies.
No, my apologies.
All right. You've got about a minute and a half to go, but go ahead. Please proceed.
Thank you. Thanks. We are all aware that the COVID-19 pandemic has intensified the revenue pressures faced by news publishers. In response, we moved quickly to try and help. We announced a grant program for 85 Canadian local news publishers for emergency expenses associated with COVID-19 reporting, totaling more than $1 million. We also invested $1 million in a partnership with the Canadian Press to launch the Canadian Press Facebook News Fellowship, creating 8 new journalism positions across Canada that are directly adding capacity for reporting from local communities. And we just announced 2 additional Indigenous news fellowships. My role and the role of my team is to partner directly with news publishers to maximize the value that free Facebook tools provide for their businesses. This includes free distribution that sends people directly to their websites, a value we estimate to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars per year for the Canadian news industry.
Furthermore, Facebook has invested over $10 million in the past 4 years in the Canadian news ecosystem. And we are thrilled with these continuing partnerships. We are determined to do it not because news is an important source of revenue for us, that is not the case, but because it is beneficial for Canadian democracy and society.
I'd like to end with some thoughts on internet regulation. Facebook welcomes more regulation.
We are all for strict laws on privacy that offer clear protection to citizens and require businesses like ours to be responsible when we make mistakes. We agree that tax agreements should be put in place through the OECD, which Canada participates in.
The status quo of having private companies decide what is and isn't acceptable speech online is not sustainable longer term and lacks transparency and accountability. Finally, we agree that more needs to be done to support the future of journalism. That said, we do think it's important to clarify that people and publishers choose to share news links on our platform, not Facebook. And requiring Facebook to pay for this, as proposed in Australia, doesn't recognize this fact. We look forward to working collaboratively across sectors to develop fact-based frameworks to ensure a thriving Canadian news ecosystem. And with that, Mr. Chair, and apologies for the technical troubles, we are happy to answer any questions from the committee.
That's all right, Mr. Chan. Thank you for that. As before, Mr. Waugh for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chan, Mr. Dinsdale, and Ms. Curran. Ms. Curran, I wasn't here when you were in the PMO office. I got here in 2015, late in 2015, but the motion put forward today, you were in the PMO office for a long time. Either you or Mr. Chan can answer that. Is that typical when you get an outside organization like Facebook in this case, sending a note to an employee of Canadian heritage asking if you could circulate this job application around? It does. There is a conflict of interest, I believe, in this personally, because Facebook does so much with the government of Canada and in particular Canadian heritage. So either one of you can answer that, then we'll move on to a couple of other things.
Yeah, maybe I'll...
Sure, go ahead, Rachel. If you...
No, go ahead, Kevin. I was going to refer that to you. Listen, the public policy talent pool in Canada is quite small. Kevin can explain more about this, but it's quite common for job postings to be circulated widely in the private sector, the public sector, among government employees. And Kevin can talk a little bit more about that, but this is common practice.
Go ahead, Mr. Chan. Go ahead.
Sure, Mr. Wall. I mean, as I indicated in the opening statement, this is in fact something. It is a public job poster. It was circulated widely, and as I indicated, there are actually instruments within the Public Service of Canada to very much facilitate this kind of cross-sectoral mobility. But I think, sir, if I may, I mean the goal is to come to better outcomes for the country. That is why we have people who go to different sectors. I've done it. Ms. Curran has done it, and I think that this is actually something that helps create better understanding and bridges those divides that I think I heard earlier expressed as concerns.
Thank you. I just finished The Tangled Garden, so that was an interesting book, and I want to thank. And you've had some input on that along with Richard Stursberg. I noticed yesterday the Independent Oversight Board overturned 4 of 5 of Facebook company's decision to remove posts with controversial content, including 2 cases of hate speech. So can you comment on that? This is, the minister before you just started talking about the hate speech and what's coming forward. And yesterday was the first time I think I recall that the independent board overturned 4 of the 5 cases that they had in front of them.
Yes, thank you very much, sir, for the question. You are absolutely right. This was the first time that the Oversight Board has issued decisions. It is still a very new board. It is a supranational governance structure that oversees and is the final board of appeal on all content decisions that Facebook makes. And you are correct, sir, that yesterday, of the 5 decisions that the Oversight Board issued decisions on, they overturned 4 of our decisions. And as per the arrangement that we are bound to with this independent oversight board, we will honor and implement the decisions that the oversight board made, and we will take their policy recommendations and advice as advisory to our own content policies going forward.
Mr. Chan, in your introduction, you talked about the millions of dollars Facebook contributes to Canadian media. We've heard from coast to coast, as you know, the newspaper industry does not share your excitement. Just talk about the newspaper industry. I mean, everybody watched France. They have an agreement with Google and I think Facebook. Australia does not. The minister was before you a couple of moments ago. We don't have an agreement yet. We don't have a Made in Canada agreement, which we desperately need. But the concern is, through the Newspaper Association, rightfully or wrongfully in your mind, that you're stealing their content and paying nothing for it. And that has been an issue for a number of years. Would you please address that today?
Absolutely, sir. I mean, specifically on this question of stealing, Facebook does not steal the content of newspapers and news publishers. As I indicated, pay for it? Well, sir, we do pay for some news where there is a voluntary arrangement with that. I think, as I indicated, I think the challenge for us is very much an internet mechanical problem, which is to say that if a publisher shares content onto Facebook and we are not able to control how much and how often they share, and if we are then required to pay for what they share, then I think you can appreciate how quickly that breaks down, and we're unable to accommodate. Now, having said that, sir, as my colleague Mark Dinsdale said in the opening statement, on the flip side of this value proposition is the free distribution that we provide to publishers. And as Mark said, we are looking at something on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars in value to the newspaper industry through free distribution on Facebook in Canada. And so we do think it's important that that be acknowledged and that be recognized.
Yeah, I would agree with you there, acknowledged and recognized, and yet I do see the bottom lines of Post Media and Torstar and such, and they would not share the excitement. They see their product exclusively on Facebook, and they're not getting their due share of revenue from it. And going forward, and it doesn't have anything to do with C10, the Broadcasting Act, but there is a media component here that the minister said will bring forward in the coming months. Newspapers are dropping like flies in this country. And this is one of the biggest issue, if not the biggest issue right now in that industry, is they're getting nothing from you.
Thank you, Mr. Waugh. Appreciate that. We now go to our next questioner, Mr. Housefather, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Chan, Mr. Dinsdale, and Ms. Curran. It's great to see you here. Thank you for coming. Three quick things. First, I think the email between Mr. Chan and Mr. Ripley has been adequately dealt with. Second, I greatly appreciate Facebook's recent decision to ban Holocaust denial on its platform. And I also appreciate your quarterly transparency reports. And I wish that other platforms would do the same. And third, many of my constituents and I share a real frustration about the growing amount of anti-Semitism on the platform and the lack of response with respect to complaints that are made. And I'd request to have a call with you guys on that separately, if that's okay. So I have a lot of questions, and if you can answer in one word, yes or no, or briefly, that would be great. And if not, I'll ask you to follow up in writing. So there's about 2.5 billion people that are regular users of Facebook, about 23 million in Canada, and a number of those people do post messages that violate Facebook policies. Would you agree that Facebook has an obligation to deal with that content, Mr. Chen?
We have a responsibility to remove anything that violates our community standards. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. And you'd agree also that the people that you employ in content moderation play a very important role in that, correct?
The 35,000 people that work on content moderation at Facebook, yes, they do play an important role, sir.
And you'd agree, of course, that nuance is important, and it's important for people to understand the language the post was made in and the political realities of that country when they assess whether something violates the policies, correct?
Correct. That is why you have a public policy team in Canada, sir.
So can I ask the question, in terms of the 35,000 people that do content moderation, how many of them are based in Canada?
I'm not sure, sir, that I'm able to give that answer, but as I indicated, I think what you're asking is who at Facebook actually is making sure they understand the nuances, for example, in Quebec, where you represent, sir, but also elsewhere in the country. And in fact, the public policy team in Canada, while many have speculated about where we spend most of our time, I'm pleased to share with you that the team in Canada is actually the tip of the spear, if you will, on understanding these things. We are the ones that bring back the local, political, and cultural context back to ensure that our community standards are enforced accordingly.
But Mr. Chen, I'm sure you'd understand that if Mr. Zuckerberg was before the US Congress and was asked how many people of the content moderators were based in the United States, and he wasn't able to give an answer. For example, I could argue that there's probably less than 100, probably less than 50 of the content moderators who actually have a lot of discretion are based in Canada. I think you'd find that unacceptable, and I would make a request that going forward, Facebook take it to head office that we need more content moderators in Canada. Let me go into another question.
We will undertake to do that, sir. Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chen.
Thank you.
Does Facebook control what is in my news feed through your algorithms?
No, sir. Actually, the way it works is people positively connect. They choose to connect with friends and family or to organizations. So, for example, perhaps your Facebook page. And then what newsfeed does is just it sorts the content that individuals have already chosen to connect to.
No, I understand that. But if I, for example, choose to search for white supremacy or I choose to search for swastikas, Facebook is going to have an algorithm or whatever you use, I would think it's an algorithm, to determine that this is my area of interest. So would it not that mean that Facebook would be, on some occasions, inadvertently, of course, proactively amplifying hate speech or incitement to violence?
I don't think so, sir, but let me turn it to Rachel, because she's been working very closely with CJA and other organizations on this very matter when you search for these kinds of terms on Facebook. Rachel, would you care to answer?
Yeah, that's a great question, MP Housefather. So what we have done, and we announced this on Holocaust Remembrance Day this week, is if you search for those kinds of terms, if you search for terms that are related to the Holocaust, swastika, white supremacy, you are going to get a notification that directs you to an off-site website developed with the World Jewish Congress that gives you credible information on the Holocaust. So users will get a notification on Facebook that says, go to this site.